Great, good. Well, welcome to this session. So we have got 5 different presentations in this session. I think we've got until 12:10. So if I can just remind people to keep to the 10 minutes. And if you do go over, I will cut in and eventually cut you off if you go too long, but I'm sure that won't be the case. So great, so let's start with our first presentation. So Alec and Susan, and your presentation is called Epistemic Violence, Authoritarian Sanctions. I'll hand over to you.
Hi everyone. Our paper's actually Troubling Tolleckism in Several Voices, Resisting Epistemic Violence in Creative, Analytical and Critical Autoethnographic Practice.
Sorry.
No. Okay, I'll start. In 2010, the sociologist Martin Tolleck strongly advocated the need for authors to always seek consent from those written about in autoethnographic work, whenever authors perceive a risk that the latter group may be hurt or offended by what's written about them. So what we're going to do today is selectively present from our JOAE in-press critical response to Tolleck's influential paper. The thrust of our position is that Tolleckism constitutes epistemic violence. We define this as dogmatic inflexibility around the need to secure consent and authoritarian sanctions over what kind of knowledge should and shouldn't be disseminated. So we're going to read selected excerpts from our paper now. Over to you, Alec.
Susan and I began discussing Tolleck's critique back in November last year in the context of our relationship, where I function as her PhD external advisor. Grounded in an institutional and disciplinary normative perspective, Tolleck takes issue with what he sees as a violation of relational ethics in the work of prominent narrative autoethnographers. As a highly committed autoethnographer, his article triggered anger in me when it was first published. These feelings haven't gone away. Because Susan was also triggered by the article, I asked if she would make a contribution as second author in crafting a response to it. Happily for me, she agreed.
My own research focuses on animation's potential as a vehicle for the investigation of psychological trauma and its associated symptoms. I'm using autoethnography as a methodology to explore my experiences as a survivor of both domestic violence and sexual violence and epistemic injustice perpetrated on me while I was in the UK mental health system. I take issue in my doctoral thesis with the admonishment in Tolleck's article that novice autoethnographers wishing to write about stigmatized experience, such as suicide and mental health difficulties, should think carefully of the consequences. His warning that such material is like a permanent ink tattoo could be experienced as shaming and silencing.
Silencing is evident in Tolleck's proscriptions on choice of topic and displays of identity. Choosing the topic very carefully in regard to whether or not it might harm someone, as Tolleck advocates, carries with it the message to avoid relationally challenging issues. Many autoethnographers feel driven to story their experiences precisely because of such challenges. If the Tolleckist message is taken to its logical conclusion, risk-averse autoethnographic inquiry would result in anodyne, unexciting, and unengaging work.
In the aftermath of my sexual abuse by a psychiatrist, it took years before I felt able to disclose what had happened, partly due to him blackmailing me into silence by insisting that it would devastate his mother if the truth was revealed, and partly due to my fear of being disbelieved due to my mental health label. So I take issue with Tolleck's warning that those with stigmatized experience should think twice about revealing it. His exhortation to respect the needs of abusers is troubling, given that abusers have so little respect for their victims. Moreover, autoethnographers seeking consent from their abusers might precipitate further abuse or harm. As Kate Mann argues, Confronted abusers tend to deflect responsibility onto their victims in the attempt to gaslight, discredit them. This is something I personally experienced when my psychiatrist tried in court to use my diagnostic label as evidence that I was a manipulative fantasist. Ultimately, my testimony was believed, but such vindication seems rare in the face of the general perception of psychiatric service users as non-credible witnesses. The ethical imperative to challenge destructive silencing overrides the rights of abusers to be respected. When victims can't access justice through the courts, it's essential they have an outlet where they can tell their truth, and autoethnography fulfills this function.
A major problem I have with Tolicist authoritarian moralizing is in its masturbation. Albert Ellis coined this term to characterize trying to live up to unrealistic and absolutistic demands. In Ellis's terms, should, ought, must living amounts to self-abuse. Now, of course, words such as should and must sometimes add necessary emphasis to narratives. However, equally, they exploit rhetorical authority when overused, making readers come to believe that they should and must live according to shoulds and musts.
Survivors speaking about abuse issues still run the risk of being shamed, silenced, and disbelieved by those who wish to help them or harm them in social media, academia, and other institutions. In this regard, Tolic's admonition to avoid parading stigmatized experience amounts to yet another belittling of the powerless by those in power. In the ethical foundations of the Western legal system, prosecution, defense, testimony, cross-examination, and the expectation that testimony be based on reality and not speculation are all in place to maintain integrity, dissuade false allegations, and arrive at the truth. Theoretically, there's an ethical imperative in law that all voices have the right to be heard, but in practice, power imbalances and societal prejudices promote and maintain epistemic injustice through many aspects of the system. My own experience of this occurred during my psychiatric litigation when the defence barrister attempted to weaponise my diagnosis, suggesting that I was disturbed and unreliable and therefore without credibility. I was ultimately believed and won my case, but will always wonder what would have happened had that barrister successfully invalidated my testimony. Would I have been able to survive such psychic annihilation? Conversely, if I'd listened to advice to stay silent and not risk the trauma of litigation and the possibility, given my psychiatric label and the nature of my case, of not being believed, how would that have affected me psychologically? I use this example of my courtroom experience to emphasise the huge risks those who have experienced stigma and injustice must often take if they wish to be heard. We may be accused of lying and slander, face ridicule and rejection, and experience further harm through acts of revenge. But for those of us entrapped within dehumanising and invalidating power structures, the process of restoring ourselves through autoethnographic testimony allows us to challenge these oppressive master narratives and prejudices. In the interests of witnessing and social justice, many of us refuse to be silenced. And for my part, I'm willing to take responsibility for the ethical decisions I make, such as naming abusers without seeking informed consent in my autoethnographic practice.
Our philosophical position in our paper is influenced by feminist philosophy. Kate Mann argues that misogyny functions as the institutional systemic policing arm of patriarchal culture. The victims of misogyny, women, are punished for stepping out of normative line by refusing the tacit patriarchal expectations placed on them to suffer abuse and silence. We believe that Tolicist epistemic violence works in the service of academic patriarchal culture. Siren Kader states a difference between the neo-Kantian rational or institutional fixed rule-based autonomy advocated in Tolicism and relational autonomy. When necessary and flexibly used in the service of critically reflexive researcher self-governance, relational autonomy poses a challenge to the sufficiency of rational fixed rule autonomy. We believe that in trying to police researchers with regard to what they should and shouldn't do, Tolic functions as a methodological colonizer in the service of the inflexible rational ethics of his discipline, sociology, and the institutional norms of mainstream qualitative inquiry informing academic research ethics committees. We think that these committees need to broaden their focus to sympathetically encompass relational as well as fixed rule ethics.
In our view, the most damaging thing about Tolicism is in the silencing of all who want to speak out about abuse experiences. We wonder how many excellent autoethnographies have never happened due to Tolic's paper. And it's our hope that our paper will go some way towards redressing this state of affairs. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Alec. Very powerful and very persuasive. Okay, next up we have Joseph. So Joseph Cleary, and just as I've made a mistake with the first title, I'm sure I'm going to make one with this, because Joseph, has your title changed?
It has, yes. The new title is A Suburban Funeral.
Okay, I did get a notification of that, so there we go. I've put it in the chat. A Suburban Funeral.
Okay, thank you. No, it was entirely my doing. So, so thank you, and good morning, everybody. I think it's morning time for where most of you are, or perhaps not. It certainly is here in normally cold Buffalo, New York. So I'm an assistant professor at Buffalo State College in Buffalo, New York, in the US. Apologies for the very bureaucratic interrogation-like bright light behind me. But it was either a choice between that and darkness. So anyways, this is, the name of this paper is A Suburban Funeral. This is a very, like the first paper, a very personal, vulnerable, deeply traumatic event that the paper centers on, and that is the untimely death of my mom, the sudden, unexpected, untimely death of my mom at age 59 years old, in her sleep, in our hometown, my hometown of suburban southwestern Connecticut, in March of 2006. And so that's the primary impetus of this paper. And, you know, after many years of sort of being a good sociologist and voluntarily so, being a traditional sociologist and an ambitious sociologist and writing for publishing, you know, I kind of stumbled onto something deeply personal, and I haven't stopped writing since. And unlike any writing I've ever done, this writing just seems to be always there at the surface and ready to come out. And it is something I've been, I guess, dwelling in for the last 15 years. And so I don't have to really think about the writing deliberately in the normal process of idea making like I normally do when writing or thinking. It's just always there. And it's led to an incredible degree of therapy, but also very, in my opinion, the best writing I've ever done. And it's hard, but it's also, it's not as hard as other writing because it is just always, it's just there. And so the primary event is of the story focuses on the death of my mom, but then there's a secondary traumatic event that it focuses on, and that can be seen as an effect of the first trauma, and that is the breakup. The breakup of my relationship with my then girlfriend, a woman I was deeply in love with, and that led to a secondary trauma. But ultimately, this paper tries to ask the following question, and that is, what does the death of my mom, the most traumatic event in my life, what does the death of my mom have to do with the complete collapse and total collapse of my ability to find love and to find romance, and that has been the most painful secondary form of trauma of the death of my mom. So what I'm going to do is read at least one excerpt, if not two, at most two excerpts, but that's kind of an overview. Again, all this started in March of 2006 in the state of Connecticut. The event itself did. The excerpt that I'm about to read took place in New York City. And so here we go. This was Monday, March 27th, 2006, the Upper East Side of New York, New York. My roommate was an anxious and likable young Republican whose father was a senior executive at IBM and whose mother enjoyed playing tennis with her friends on weekdays. He was still gainfully employed at the time as a financial advisor. Unlike me, I was not employed at the time. On this fateful morning, after exiting our 5-story pre-war walk-up, my roommate begins the trek up 2nd Avenue toward this 86th Street subway. It must have been disorienting to see my dad walking his way with a strange man who my roommate did not recognize. My dad broke the bad news, and the three of them, now walking as one unit, willed themselves in my direction. It had to have been a daunting task, but it had to be done. My first memory was of my dad standing over me, arm extended. My uncle is behind him. That was the strange man, as scared as I have ever seen him. We are inside my tiny bedroom quarters that are set in the back of this shotgun-styled apartment away from 2nd Avenue, facing a dark and bleak pastiche of concrete sidings, alleyways, and other urban geometric shapes, angles, and utilities. End wires. My dad's unsteady hand woke me up. Immediately, I knew something was very wrong. The only time my parents came to my apartment was on heavily anticipated weekend trips. My parents loved visiting me, wherever I was living, at college in Amish country or in New York City. But this was clearly something very different. My dad, uncle, and roommate looked like spectators to a live performance, an unfolding tragedy, and I am the primary focus of this scene. Unlike Broadway, though, this is real, and they are afraid. Joe, my dad said, leaning over me, partially seated on the side of my bed, trying to desperately ease me into the horror. It's Mom. Oh, excuse me. Before he got out another word, I preempted him. Did she die? Seemingly somehow, an only child, I think, always knows that this is somehow coming. With his eyes closed, he nods his head. I get up, walk silently past the three men and into our 1970s style bathroom. Now, those of you that have seen the movie, the remake, 1983 remake, Scarface, will understand this reference. My bathroom had an unusual decor, glitter on the mirrors that plastered the walls, starting around my shoulders and extending up to the high ceiling. It was more appropriate for Tony Montana's Miami Beach mansion. I lower my boxers and relieve myself. I was performing a routine act amidst the greatest crisis of my life. For all the things I could have been thinking, in this moment, I thought about the 1.5 years I had spent working on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange as a trading assistant. Specifically, I thought about that ideal that the floor engenders on its members of ignoring one's external environment in order to complete the task at hand. The floor became a part of my subconsciousness, my psychological DNA, unlike any job I have ever had before or since. I was intoxicated by the power it bestowed within me. I emerged from the bathroom. The three nervous men relocated to the kitchen by now. I look up at my uncle, thoughts of the floor of the New York Stock Exchange still fresh. And I tell him, I think I've forgotten how to cry. Let it out, buddy, he advises me, just like my mom would say. I don't let it out, not yet. My roommate is still in an apparent state of shock. He is afraid for me. I am grateful for this. Finally, he must leave for work. My dad, uncle, and I are now in my dad's car on some highway headed back to our 2,800 square foot, 1.5 acre colonial. I look at the highway in the morning rush hour. Maybe we are on the major Deegan Expressway. Maybe it's a cross-county highway. These are, well-traveled, well-commuted New York City metro area highways. But we're headed against the traffic towards the suburbs. The morning's brightness and unsympathetic continuance make me uneasy then and now. Eventually we arrive at our destination. There waiting for us is a somber collection of family and friends. One of the weird things about a death of a loved one is watching friends walk around your kitchen like it is their own. And that's the setup. And the paper from there goes into kind of a chronology of the next few days. Visiting, I was raised Protestant, so we didn't have a viewing, but we privately, my dad and uncles, and I'm told other people, close people, visited my mom for one last time at the funeral home. I kissed her on the forehead. It was extremely cold. I remember that. And I go through events like that. We were back in my house in the kitchen, and there were people eating and drinking and trying to console me. I talk about the funeral and the speech I gave for her, and the story I told about the day we played hooky together from school, and she took me to the batting cages. And then I kind of proceed from there, talking about the rest of that summer. I go from day by day, then kind of a week by week, and then a month by month chronology leading up to, or sort of leading into the next big traumatic event, which at the time was not traumatic, but it represents a trauma. And that was the breakup I had with the woman that I was planning on marrying and having children with. I was deeply in love with, and the only woman I've ever been deeply in love with. But just as a summary, that was traumatic.
Just going to cut in. You've got about 30 seconds or so.
Okay. Okay. I'll just make the.
Brilliant. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jamie. So yeah, that was traumatic because, and I didn't know this until I started writing autoethnographically, and this is kind of the contribution, one of the contributions to the session theme, that I realized in writing autoethnographically that she was everything I wasn't. She was conservative and Catholic and threatened my identity, but specifically the identity I got from my mother. And so that is what made it deeply traumatic. And that is what has made the possibility of future relationships since then deeply traumatic, because I feel like I'm going to lose who I am and thus my connection to my mom. And I only got there through writing and thinking autoethnographically. And I think that that is not a dilemma or a challenge of autoethnography, but it is sort of a triumph of autoethnography. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. You've actually preempted one of the questions I was going to ask you later in the question section about autoethnography and what it's afforded for you. So anyway, I'm sure there's going to be a chance to talk some more about your experience and your writing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so next up we have Kyungmee Lee from Lancaster.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you see my screen? I'm sharing.
We can. That's excellent.
All right, that's good.
Great.
Thank you. I have changed my title, but this is not title on the screen, so that's okay, Jamie. Just before starting about my presentation, this is going to be about how difficult it is to teach autoethnography to doctoral students when you're not involved in the field where autoethnography is growing dominant kind of idea. So I'm Kyungmee Lee. I'm a lecturer at Lancaster University and co-director at the Center for Technology Enhanced Learning. As you can hear, in my field, what is very popular at the moment is big data and machine learning. I'm sorry, Jamie, just to double check, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, that's good. So basically, everyone is talking of big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence, that huge data from the learning management system can somehow tell us how to predict student success and failure. That kind of story is very, very dominant in my field at the moment. And as you can see, by the fact that I'm here with you today, I have a very different view about what research should be in our research practice. So this is a little kind of story that I want to tell you what have happened in my experience when I try to teach my doctoral student. So basically, each year, I teach autography to a cohort of 30 doctoral students in my research methodology module in TEL online doctoral program. So basically, at the beginning of module, my students are very confident-looking, experienced professionals. Many of them are more experienced than me. They're senior lecturer, and some of them are experienced researcher at their well-received institution of research. And all of them are walking into my module and eager to commence their project conveniently, often situated in their workplace. They seem to know that what they want to do. Nevertheless, none of them, of course, want to be a center of their research. Instead, they want to be partial and invisible voice, a member of their project. Many are positivist, although they are not going to be aware of it or admit it. There's somehow everyone seems to think that it's fashionable to call them as social constructivists, but most believe certainly they are not allowed to use I in their academic writing. So first week, everyone present themselves as the best presentable possible self in the module space. Everyone is professional, but all of them, and including myself, is rather unsure if this is the right way to present themselves. And surprisingly, many do not feel comfortable to talk about their personal problems. We're all excited, including myself, but at the same time, a sense of comparison and competition emerged. I will try to use the term we throughout my presentation because I'm one of them too, because I somehow feel intimidated and not good enough when I compare myself with those established researchers coming from a little bit more privileged background, at least on surface. So here it comes. I introduce autography and I ask questions such as, what are you going to do about this module's project? Tell us one of your stories that currently make you feel uncomfortable and uneasy and difficult, unclear, etc. And this is shock to many of my students. They don't really understand what autography is. Many of them haven't heard about it at all. And very understandably, many feel uncomfortable, and a few students would actually write, having to do or being forced to do autography in this module is what currently makes me feel uncomfortable, although they do not choose it as their assignment will be. I mean, as a side note, I'll be thrilled to read their assignment on being forced to do autography in module 1. However, it seems to be too risky for them to do as a first-year PhD student. So basically what I do is I go first. So I ask question on the Zoom, how many of you have expected to be taught by someone looking like me? And I can see some smiles and giggles sometimes. And there's another one. And I share my personal stories of growing up as a critical pedagogue in the field of TEL, which is very positivist. And also I share my ongoing struggles as a doctoral educator in the UK, from very different cultural background. I'm Korean basically, and I have been grown up in Korean. I educated in Canada a little bit before coming to UK, but I speak English as my second language, and I'm still trying to settle down in this country. And that's sharing that kind of story, and then being consistently challenged by students and getting negative feedback from students, sometimes being kind of rejected. It all works well. So it set the scene. So after that, kind of me going forced, and students try to share, and some of them are sharing really, really personal stories, and then it gets the conversation going. However, guiding students through this initial stage of disorientation and confusion and subsequent resistance in some cases, and some are really strong resistance that I faced, and helping them to see the value of doing autography and autography as the research methodology to invest social society, social issue require tremendous pedagogical effort. Extended hours also go into establishing and maintaining positive relationship with the cohort throughout the module period. After all, however, I would not be 100% successful. There are some beautiful autography written as the outcome. However, some students still do not like it and hate it at the end of module. So the question is then, why I'm doing it, why I insist on this programmatic and labor-intensive teaching methodology in my module, where I can easily do more widely used, accepted research methodology, so-called case study. Everyone will be all right with that. If I introduce big data, everyone will be even thrilled more. To add some weight to this question, It's not only my students who find doing autobiography uneasy, but so do some of my colleagues teaching on the same program. For the past 4 years, I have been consistently challenged by my colleagues. Some criticism results from their genuine misunderstanding of what autobiography is or what students are able to do in my module. But other criticism are more directly from their dissatisfaction with my pedagogical approach, or sometimes disapproval, which certainly reflects some unequal power relationship among the tutor team. So most common criticism, which is in line with some of the criticism as a methodology we'll get from other fields, is a lack of exposure to diverse research methods and students only do autobiography in your module. I believe that learning a methodology requires time and effort. I do not believe that being exposed to several methodology from different perspectives and paradigms, it's very briefly, didn't do a justice to my students. The aim is to develop a deeper understanding and perspective, not factual knowledge of how to conduct research in my module. So autobiography is overarching research approach, but my students employ a range of different research topics and methods, as we noticed throughout this conference period, and data collection strategy and analytic techniques. They also use different methods to validate their findings, not to remain self-indulgent, which is a very scary thing among my students. Subsequently, the outcome represents a greater diversity and creativity in my module. And another criticism, a lack of conversation on research ethics, and students do collect self-data only. Most students collect data from their closest others, more diverse groups of others, including friends, family, colleagues, students, and themselves, beyond what you can create, what we can collect from learning management system. Subsequently, students think about relational ethics and self-ethics more seriously. In fact, telling detailed story about personal struggles and those occasions deeply rooted in social relationship while maintaining the autonomy of others in their story, avoiding the misrepresentation of unknown intentions of others' behavior. At the same time, protecting the future relationship with some of the very closest other is a difficult task, but as a first-year PhD student, many do it beautifully. Thus, I will respond to the concerns accordingly. However, the other more fundamental criticism of my pedagogy shut me up. So for example, in February 2021, a colleague A has sent an email to the entire tutor team, putting my module on spot again. And her points are like the below 3. So she basically prefers to allow students to use methodology that they like, or in line with their research paradigm. And she also does prefer a student-centered approach to teaching that supports students to develop in the direction of they choose. And she also believes in the provision of alternative forms of assessment for disabled students who may feel a bit more uncomfortable with the idea. The shared theme in this criticism is a breach of inclusive teaching practice. In A's eyes, my teaching must be very authoritarian, teacher-centered, and exclusive of those who are labeled as not able, which is very problematic to begin with, but I will leave it for this in this presentation. At face value, A's argumentations are always so sound and politically correct enough for me not to say anything bad. However, it is incredibly frustrating and interesting at the same time, because ultimately I teach autobiography to enact inclusive critical pedagogy to help everyone in the module, including myself as a tutor, with my own underprivileged identity markers, focus on our own life struggles and engage with the critical sense-making process of those struggles through a form of research act. And one more example here is in a meeting room before the COVID-19, colleague B looked at the list of students' assignment titles and goes like this, these are nothing to do with TEL research. Aren't you supposed to teach students how to conduct a TEL research? I do worry how students will be able to do a TEL research in subsequent module if they didn't learn it from the first module, which is apparently only research methodology module in the program. Well, again, B is correct. Many students have researched non-TEL stuff. I mean, there's research topics about their personal relationship, but not really about technology. Because those are the stuff they wanted to research. In these fields, students did not learn anything from the module, but is it true? Although thinking, talking, and doing in my modes are not learning then, what is learning in TEL program then? Is there any specific thing about TEL research? Is TEL something alien from our everyday struggles? I feel eager to say something, a lot of things actually, but why bother? It's too complex to explain the inclusivity in my pedagogy, or it is too obvious to preach the importance of gaining critical consciousness about social issues and struggles embedded in our own researcher's life. This is an essence and characteristic of a good scholar in any given field of inquiry, in my view, including TEL. But I don't know where to start. So I remain silent and thinking maybe one day I can write about it. The decision creates very uncomfortable silence, as you can guess, but I refuse to fill the silence with my desperate self-justification mumbles. I do not give up my pedagogical approach. So this is ongoing autobiography project, and you can see some reference that I've been already written, different aspects of the very complex social phenomena of teaching autobiography in TEL. But I do this because I see a lot of pedagogical value of doing so. The first of all, it enables us as the doctoral community, including myself as tutor, to share our vulnerability with each other. It can be quite awkward for me to just ask questions that how many have you expected me as Asian immigrant to teach you when you register in UK university? That's quite out of context, but while I teach autobiography, that's perfect, that makes it perfect sense. And also to enable us to become authentic being in our TEL researchers. As I mentioned briefly, the students' topic that eventually they choose is nothing to do with technology, but it's all about them. And that gave them a greater sense of who they are as a researcher. And then they grow into more sensitive, in my view, TEL researcher. They're not going to go and say that we need to collect big data. It also enables us to understand who we are, data and tool and idea and many other things. Not data has a better idea than researcher. I think that's really awkward phrase. And lastly, it enables us to form a real community. I'm having great time with my students, and many of them really engage in the community as a genuine per self. And then it really enabled me to enact critical pedagogy inclusively without framing anything using some of the surface marker. Because at the end of the day, whether who I am or who my students, at the end of the day, we're going to all work on our personal struggles. So I think that's it for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyungmee. Thank you. If you could just turn off your screen share. Thank you.
Doing it. Cool.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah, wow. I'll save my comments till the end. Okay, thank you. So, okay, next up we have, Helen Woodley. Do we have Helen here? Yes, hi, Helen. Okay, and as far as I know, your title is, there it is. We both know you wouldn't say it to my face like this. Okay, Helen.
Hi, everyone. So is that visible to everyone? Just to make sure.
Yes, it is. That's great.
So this is a little bit of a journey through something I've been trying to do for over 2 years. And it's been parked and picked up and parked and picked up. And it's an issue both with autoethnography as a methodology and how that's received on Twitter, but it's also being part of this very little niche part of Twitter called the edu-Twitter community. And I'll explain why as we go through. So I love Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard journeys with me through a lot of autoethnographic research. And for someone who wrote, in the age that he did, things that he says are just so relevant, and they often remind me of Twitter. And to me, this quote from Kierkegaard sums up what Twitter is. It can be a muddy pond. You've got people there who do parade themselves with all the kind of like amazing things they do and how wonderful they are. But actually there are some people where you think that they're going to have a lot more to them than there is, and it's not. It's just a muddy pond of sometimes mudslinging and not always a very nice and safe space to be. But edu-Twitter is this little subset of Twitter, and it's largely from UK, American and Australian teachers. And in a positive sense, it's a space where teachers share ideas, where there's mutual support, where there's networking, where there's friendships. And on a good day, it can be like that. But EduTwitter also has this dark side, and it's a place where there is lots of trolling, and I'll come on to what that is later, subtweeting, threats to inform employers, and just a real anti-academic rhetoric. So the situation I find myself in is that I joined Twitter when I was a classroom teacher, and I joined it for all of the positive reasons of collaboration, of sharing resources, of meeting people outside of the settings that I was working with. And then when I left teaching and joined an HEI, I remained in Twitter, and I remained in this little EduTwitter community. But then I've spent 2 years trying to think about this piece and trying to think about, well, where I stand, because I now find that I'm almost an exile in a community that was once my own. And the big issue with Twitter is this whole kind of polarized debate, and we're so familiar now with polarization with everything in the world, you know, anti-vax versus vaccine supporters. You know, it's Twitter is just an example of how that polarized thought is pervasive within society. And the biggest issue for me is being somebody who doesn't think in polarized terms, who likes grey areas, who likes areas which are unclear or uncertain. And autoethnography lends itself really well to thinking about grey areas. But Twitter and EduTwitter, there isn't any space for it. And these are just the kind of things which you get comments at people on EduTwitter. There's a bit of a swear word in there, which I apologise for, but this is just an example from the last week of comments which people are making. And these are comments which teachers are making about academics and teaching. That somehow once you've crossed that line and you've left classroom teaching and you've gone into academia, you've become this different person with different values, and you're just not welcome within that community. Now, trolling is common on Twitter, but in EduTwitter, it's a really big issue. And I really recommend that people, if they look at anything, look at Elaine Campbell's 2017 autoethnographic piece, which has got the brilliant title with C*******, about how people respond to autoethnographic writing on Twitter. But trolling is a form of bullying. It's a form of trying to silence and stop debate. And I'm in a position where I'm seeing this now within this community, and yet it's a community that I'm wanting to write about. And this is just an example of what trolling is, where you just copy the person into a post and you write a negative or sarcastic comment. So that person's able to see your comment. But then in Twitter, there's also this amazing thing called subtweeting. And that's where you then aren't in the debate that's going on about you, where somebody is sometimes using a screenshot of something you've said, or they're alluding to you in a post. And the problem with this is you're not aware of the debate. So you can't be there to talk through something or to clarify a point. Whatever you've posted is taken out of context and it's become a form of truth. And that's just, I think, there's a couple of examples of subtweeting where people literally are then not able, there's no right to reply, there's no dialogue, there's no narrative that can be had. So Twitter and EduTwitter is a really hard landscape to navigate. And that's without them bringing in the fact that I want to write about my experiences in an autoethnographic way. But the crunch point for me came last year, where we had a professor of education who published an article looking at some of this polemic nature of Twitter in EduTwitter. And if you look where I've circled it, only 22 people replied to his post. Now that would make it seem that that was a really small post. 22 people commented. There were only about 6 people who actually formed those 22 comments. Doesn't look like it had that much impact. But this post was subtweeted and subtweeted again and again and again, with those anti-academic arguments kind of coming in. And it was actually one of the biggest debates and issues of last year. And that's where I now find myself in this really stormy sea, because I want to write about my experiences of being a former teacher and now an academic in this community of EduTwitter. I want to do that. But I'm aware that autoethnographic writing on Twitter can be the subject of vilification and comments. I'm aware that being an academic in EduTwitter automatically kind of places me in a position of being targeted. So I'm at a real point of fear, and I've been at this point of fear for nearly 2 years. And this current position is a really hard one to be in, because it's that sense of vulnerability in that, do I really want to put myself in a position where I know that actually I am going to be open to that criticism? I'm going to be open to criticism of autoethnography as a method, like Elaine Campbell faced, but I'm also really mindful that I'm going to be open to criticism from EduTwitter itself. That position for me is also this fear of this loss of academic status. I'm an early career researcher. I'm at the start of an academic career. And do I want to have my Twitter account and timeline full of those comments and that negativity, when Twitter is something I'm actively trying to get our students to use and to engage with? Do I want my students looking at my Twitter account and seeing those comments and those criticisms aimed at me? But I'm also in a position where I'm feeling that I have lost this right to be within this EduTwitter community. And it was a community that sustained me and supported me for such a long time. And I think part of it is that kind of grief and accepting that grief for me, that I'm no longer part of it actually. And I don't really have any right to claim membership of it. So I think accepting that actually maybe that has ended for me is something that has delayed me in writing this autoethnographic account, because maybe I haven't really wanted to face the fact that that journey and that community has come to an end. But yet there is that position where I know that there are so many people who are in my position, that you hear these kind of little snippets of stories and these little bits of narratives of people's lives that come across on Twitter. And I know that there are many former teachers who are now working in academia who have faced exactly the same issues, but we don't talk about it. It's not researched, it's hidden. And to me, that is where autoethnographic writing about it really should be coming out and should be being used to shine that light into this little hidden bit of the world and to just give voice to some of those feelings and experiences. So I do find myself right in the middle of that stormy sea. It's something where I know that I want to write this piece. I have got draft on draft sitting in a folder, and I'm trying to overcome that fear. I'm trying to overcome that kind of having to justify who I am and what I'm doing, and get to that point where actually I'm able to do that. Because otherwise this feels like a real crunch for me. If I can't write about this experience and I can't write about something which is so impactful and meaningful for me without fear of doing it, actually, what right then do I have to say that autoethnography is my methodology, that autoethnography is something that I use? I don't just want to be someone who talks about autoethnography and who writes about autoethnography as a methodological approach without being somebody who embodies that and writes that. But I'm in this place of kind of abstract fear, but also an amazing sense of longing of wanting to do it. So this kind of space for me today was just to share some of that fear, and I suppose use this whole of this conference experience to put myself in that position of vulnerability and maybe weather the storm in the knowledge that others have weathered it before. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for sharing your journey and your very honest fears of where you're at right now. I'm sure we'll have some feedback on that at the end, and maybe some tools as to how you can kind of move forwards with the things that you want to do. So thank you. Okay, we have the final presentation. Okay, Donata, who has you've already put your screen up. That's so efficient. Updates pupil places nomadic inquiry into language teachers' professional journeys. The presenters, you've made it incredibly easy for me today, everyone, so thank you. Okay, Donata, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, and I hope you can all see my presentation and you can all hear me okay. I'm speaking from Italy, and I hope you are not too tired and too hungry to listen to the presentation. So I'm going to speak about language teachers, which is my profession as well. So language teachers' professional trajectories are often marked by their moves from their homelands, which prompts a diasporic thinking of the world. This type of thinking brings at the same time loss from what is left behind and opportunities for new meanings and affiliation from their encounter with new words. Rosi Braidotti, following Deleuze and Guattari, would define this process as de-territorialization, stepping away from a notion of stability and of unity of the self and embracing relationality and uncertainty in the mapping on new territories. In this presentation, I refer to language teachers' diasporic identities, not as bounded by a linguistic group and a destination, but as members of one profession, mostly defined by nomadic movement. This paper examines higher education language teacher professional journeys, which I define as invisible stories, from written narratives and autobiographical vignettes that capture their and my own trajectories from their and initial experiences in home countries to the full development of careers in UK. Drawing on the concept of the rhizome or rhizome as a multidimensional metaphor of subjectivity and on the nomadic positioning of the self, I deconstruct the dichotomy between researcher and research, and by adopting an autoethnographic perspective as a member of the language teaching community, I became data, embodying and embracing the multiplicity of my identities as language teacher, lecturer, and researcher. Our biographies and professional trajectories into becoming language teachers and researchers, despite being different, are similar in their non-linear unfolding and in their entanglement between the personal and the professional. They are embodied and lived professional experiences where the boundaries between present, past, and future are blurred, and where the movement between the personal self, the practitioner, and the researcher are never at rest. Becoming is a verb. It implies movement, not stasis. It entails change, transformation, experimentation, motion, but also chaos and confusion. It is a zigzagging between different physical and symbolical territories, between disciplines and different discourses, between human and other than human entities that are unstable, fluid, multiple, and unpredictable. Becoming, in this sense, implies the belief of the existence of deep connection between identity making and word making. Because language teacher selves are shaped by a multiplicity of words, and at the same time, they can make cultures and words for ourselves and others, verbal and written words, real and imagined words. I argue that being and becoming a teacher and a researcher is a messy business. It is not linear and a linear development from A to B, but rather an embodied, lived, and unstable experience that unfolds itself within many territories across different languages, and that is rooted in personal experiences, never finished, always in progress. It is an assemblage of doing, being, and becoming within a nomadic, inter and intra and cross-cultural framework of reference. As Donna Haraway suggests, the search for a totalitarian and objective positioning is an idealistic quest for an unquestionable truth, while the knowing self is partial in all its guises, never finished, whole, simply there and original. It is always constructed and stitched together imperfectly, and therefore able to join with another, to see together with claiming to be another. Multidimensionality and a multiplicity of vision are key aspects of my research, together with the notion of subjectivity as multiple, fluid, and heterogeneous. I position myself within a post-human critical discourse that considers language identities as vibrant, embodied, lived, and material, and that views subjectivity as an act of permanent partiality. My journey as a language teacher started more or less 40 years ago when I was in primary school, and I was obsessed with learning English and teaching English to my dolls, to my schoolmates, and to members of my family. I carried on with that obsession later on in my life, and teaching became my profession. I've taught in different parts of the world to students of all ages, nationalities, genders, and social backgrounds, and I still consider teaching languages my obsession. Instinctively, when I started this journey as a game in primary school, I was using objects, clothes, drawings, food, colors, images, and other material artifacts that would evoke the idea of otherness and of difference. I later on developed this passion for using material objects to teach languages into a method, aligning my teaching philosophy to the communicative and task-based approach, and to a holistic and sensory perception of languages as vibrant and lived entities, rather than structural list of words and verbs. In my teaching approach, even when I was a child, I always aimed to make my students feel at home while studying a foreign language, and embracing with joy and curiosity their new emerging self as a language learner. I consider language learners as translators who are inhabiting different territories at the same time and navigate across different linguistic landscape, different semantic point of reference, and different perception of themselves while encountering new texts. Becoming minor and making of my marginality a point of force and of centrality and of empowerment has been my professional trait. My learning and teaching philosophy that found its ground also in my lived experience as a researcher. I officially started my career as a researcher in language education in 2017 when I began a doctorate in education. But I could say that, as in my narrative as language teacher, becoming a researcher is something that started unofficially much earlier. While engaging with the data collection and the writing process of my thesis, I progressively came to realize that the engagement with my current research began before it officially began, as much research does, and that the investigation into a language teacher's narrative is an act of research within myself. I grew up in a small village in the Italian Dolomites on the border with Austria and Slovenia, a place where multilingualism and cross-cultural contamination are the norm, and where I took for granted that identity is multiple and heterogeneous, a beautiful place, but a marginal place on the borders, out of the center. Despite having had a very happy childhood, I always wanted to escape that place in order to explore the world and to become other. But I realized I always go back to that space, also in my journey as a researcher, as Elizabeth St. Pierre beautifully says. I've learned that I'm much more attached to the place itself, to the land, which I now understand will always serve as the literal ground of my consciousness, the mental and physical map against which all other places collide. Sorry. It is this marginality of the place that I choose to embrace and that represent my standing point of academic investigation. Aligning my thinking with Deleuze and Guattari, with Bradotti, with Barat, conception of becoming marginal, becoming woman, becoming molecular, I embrace a decentration of the subject and of academic practice towards interaction, relationalities, and mapping as guiding principle in my research. Autobiographical narratives have been assembled, mapped, discussed, and analyzed in an ongoing process in which notion of hierarchical positioning and authorship are questioned and unsettled. The participation into my research project has been very active and embodied. Participant stories are entangled with my own personal and professional situated narrative, and the findings are defined as multi-layer assemblage, as meaning-making processes. New materialism also played an important role in my research, as well as my teaching practice, acted out in the use of artifacts and personal objects as part of the narratives within my research project. The embodied materiality of objects allowed space for encounters and for lived experiences to emerge within the playfulness of the research spirit. They paved the way for the multidimensionality of the self to be emotionally displayed and shared among participants, blurring the dichotomy between researcher and research, and creating an entanglement, an assemblage of lived experiences. In this process, I, the researcher, have been deeply affected by the power of the shared emotion and stories, by the creative spaces in between myself and participants, by the co-construction of knowledge, and by the new emotional becoming it represents, which is not only academic endeavor. My method of research is also grounded in collaborative autoethnography, employing co-writing as a method of inquiry. And I would like to finish the presentation with a couple of poems that have been written with my language teachers who participated in the journey with me. You know me, I know you. I trust you, you trust me. You know my story, I know your story. I was not supposed to be here. I belong to a different world, to a small world. I moved, I'm here. I can tell you my story. I write stories, I tell stories to my students. I make them laugh, I laugh with them. I'm proud to be here. I wanted to be different, to tell a story, a different story, my story. And the last poem, I am a chameleon. I move in between countries. I move in between languages. I'm looking for my identity. Who am I? I dance with words. I dance with my children. I play with them the games of languaging, the games of being a mother. What is a mother? I change my skin many times, not being me, being me. And just to finish off, in other words, the nomadism that I defend as a theoretical option is also an existential condition, which for me translates into a style of thinking and of mode of relation to writing. My project is to both develop and evoke a vision of critical and feminist subjectivity in a nomadic mode. This mode refers to a figurative style of thinking, slightly autobiographical, which may at times strike the reader as an epistemological stream of consciousness, but it is rigorously structured around a number of key concepts. Thank you.
Thank you, Donata. Thank you. If you could just turn off your screen share, and if I can just ask us all to unmute ourselves and give the presentations a round of applause. Brilliant, thank you. So we have about 20 minutes for discussion. So if you have a comment,